Hello, everyone. So happy to see you all here. I'm both an organizer and a speaker today. I would like to ask you to do something for me. As an organizer, I'm really interested in something. Could you please all stand up? Thank you. I'm in control now. Okay, so it's all people who are here now. Could you please, so these are all the people who are here this year. Could you please sit down if this is your first year? Okay. Thank you to all of you here. You came back. That's a good thing for us as the organizers. Could you please sit down if it's your second time? Thank you a lot. So many people. Could you please sit down if it's your third time? Wow. And could you please sit down if it's your fourth time? So we have a group of people who are here every year, and I would like to thank you especially for that. So big applause for those people. You can sit down, thank you very much. So my talk is not about choosing a new framework, because we have already chosen and it's Rails. This talk is also not about JavaScript, even though our conference is becoming a JavaScript conference. But JavaScript is a topic that we'll always come back to. So that's why we started with the JavaScript workshops today, because sooner or later, every programming conversation, every conversation between programmer ends with JavaScript. So we just wanted to be over with that. We started with JavaScript. Hopefully, we will be now a Ruby conference. I would like to tell you a story. It's a bit of a personal story. Let's travel back in time to year 1993. I'm not sure if everyone was born already. 1993, I was 13 years old. My parents ran a family business. It was a grocery store, then it evolved into a grocery store supplier. In Polish, it was a hurtownia spożywcza. So that was a family business, but it grew bigger, and there was like 20 or 30 people at our company. I was 13, and I was also helping at this company, but I was helping with some basic stuff like cleaning the stores, helping the customers, handling the incoming deliveries, and so on. Some very basic stuff. In 1993, a new law was introduced in Poland. It was the VAT, a new tax. And what was very easy before that time now became very complicated and very bureaucratic. So calculating the taxes was very complex. 1993 was the year where almost all companies in Poland were looking for a software and hardware to help them calculating those taxes. So that was I think that was the beginning of the software boom in Poland. 1993 was a year when there was no computers at work, and the computers at homes were usually the ones that, like me as a teenager, I've had my Atari and then Commodore 64. So I was among the 30 people in that company. I was the only one person who was actually able to type on a keyboard to understand what's going on with those machines a little bit. My experience, my programming experience at that time was mostly retyping snippets of code from a Polish magazine called Bytek, from the paper magazine into my Atari or Commodore 64. I didn't understand at all what I'm doing, just retyping. But given my experience, I've became what I now know was a CTO position at my parents' company. So I was a 13-year-old CTO, which I regret I didn't know back then, because that would make a good news headlines, 13-year-old CTO. So I didn't know it. I didn't have my CTO salary, unfortunately. But I became responsible for finding the software for our company. And I was responsible for making the tender, talk to people, talk to salespeople who were coming to us, and choose the right software. I was 13. I was quite short at that time. I've had my fascination with death metal. I was wearing my black t-shirt with skulls and blood everywhere. And that was the clothes I was wearing when I was talking to the salespeople. And I was the one making decisions. So I don't think they expected that. And they've had a hard time to find in this situation. In the end, we've decided to choose one company based on recommendations. It was a company where the only programmer was called, let's call him Mr. Krzysztof. He was a really good programmer. Other companies were using his software already, so for us it was a much easier choice. Once we decided to stay with him, with his software, the whole process of introducing the software into our company was like 2-3 weeks. And then we started. Very quick operation. And everything just worked. And it wasn't surprising to me. For me, it was like, those are machines. Mr. Krzysztof is a good programmer, so why would anything break, right? Everything is just working. That was the year. We also had to choose some hardware, so obviously I decided on the hardware that was able to run some good games, like SimCity or Wolfenstein. So I was more interested in that part as well. And once we even introduced the software into our company, I was still the only person able to use this software. So I became like a full-time person in our company, serving the customers, taking their orders, and doing everything with the software that was needed. Mr. Krzysztof was very agile, as we would call him now. I don't think this word existed in 1993. He was coming to us with a big luggage. It was a notebook at that, very huge one. And he was basically pairing with me, with us, applying some changes. I think he was using Turbo Pascal with this blue background. And whenever he made a change, he copied the software into a floppy disk. I put the floppy disk into my machine. It was the 5-inch floppy disk. I put it into my machine. There was this upgrade operation taking like 10 minutes, and everything was working. And we've had several of such upgrades, and everything was just fine. Until one day. I was serving a customer. She came to buy some new products for their grocery store. We've had a new kind of cookies in our offer. So she decided to choose those cookies. She took something else as well. I've printed the invoice. I printed the order. I took the money, and everything seemed to be fine. So I passed the order to our employee who managed the whole giving the products from the magazine, from the store. And I launched SimCity, which was launching like 1 or 2 minutes before it actually started. And just after I started playing, choosing the right place for my new commercial building in SimCity, the customer came back very angry. I think she was overreacting a bit. She was very angry at me and about some kind of situation which I wasn't able to understand at first. And she was pointing at me and she told that I'm not the right person to work here, I'm making mistakes and this is wrong. So I asked what's going on, and our employee said that apparently she wanted cookies, but what I gave her was water because that's what's printed. So I gave her mineral water. I've checked the software and it was clearly cookies on the screen. I printed it and it was the mineral water again. So I called Mr. Krzysztof, and quite quickly he arrived. He looked at the situation. Now I see how professionally he handled the situation, because he first focused on fixing the problem and then he started looking for what was really wrong. So he made this fix, he gave me this floppy disk, I applied the floppy disk, and everything started working again. So the cookies became cookies on paper. And then he apologized to me, to us, and he said, it was my mistake. I wrote some wrong code. So he didn't go too much into details. It's only now that I understand that he was reusing some kind of records in the database. And he apologized. We didn't really lose money, so in theory, the whole thing is over now. But for me, it was like the whole world collapsed. My understanding of how software worked was damaged. That was the day when I lost trust to old programmers. I stopped trusting programmers because Mr. Krzysztof was a very intelligent and very smart person, smart developer, plus very good hardware, very good machine. This combination produced a bug. I don't think we used the term bug that time. But that was like, okay, so the one of the stable things in my life is not stable. I can't trust programmers. My name is Andrzej Krzywda, and this was a story about why and how I'm interested in software architectures and why I spent already almost 20 years trying to understand how to make programmers not making mistakes. And I'm still failing at that. But over time, I was trying to research different architectures and different techniques. And I was researching things like, quite early I went to university, and quite early I became interested in aspect-oriented programming. I thought it was a silver bullet at some point. It solves all the problems. It didn't. Then I became interested in clean architecture by Uncle Bob. Then I became interested in hexagonal architecture. I know some of you were following my blog, so you may know about those adventures when I was writing about them. I was very fascinated by the idea of the DCI architecture, data context interaction. But they all didn't solve my problems. So I was just collecting some small bits of those architectures just to build my wisdom and to be able to apply those. But it never actually was the thing that solved the problem. Over the time, I was looking at some blog posts, and very often the topic of DDD appeared. But once I looked at a blog post, it was a DDD blog post about sagas. We will have a talk about sagas tomorrow by Robert. Another blog post was about aggregates, and then there was a blog post about value objects, and then there was a blog post about bounded context. And I counted all those new terminology that comes with DDD, and there's like 40 new concepts. And it's a nightmare to start doing DDD because it's such a big thing. And it took us years, it took me years and us as Arkansas to start applying DDD. And I was wondering if there is an easier way. And today I would like to show you some techniques which hopefully will reduce your time. If you're interested in going DDD, it can reduce your time of applying the DDD. So my goal is to first convince you that DDD is worth being interested in, and second, being able to apply it very, very soon. With DDD, what I found in our projects is that it's really helpful to structure our code base, but also it's something that is not really measurable, so I can't really prove it. But I believe that there is an increasing domain understanding among programmers once we do DDD. So programmers understand the client needs better, the users needs better. And I think that if this talk is about lessons learned, at my case, I believe that our biggest mistake as a company was not applying DDD sooner. We started doing DDD like 3 years ago. And once I connected the dots, the different concepts, I'm still not a DDD expert. I don't want to sound like someone who knows everything about DDD. At some point, Mirek Pragłowski joined our team, and Mirek was a person from the .NET world, and DDD in .NET is quite popular. The nice thing with DDD is that you can learn from other communities using the same language of communication because it's the same. There's nothing about DDD that makes it special for certain kind of programming languages, which makes it much easier to communicate with Java people, .NET people, PHP people, maybe, JavaScript people. So what I've identified, first of all, to save your time, it's good to learn what are the example code bases, what is the ideal DDD. That's a tweet. If you go to my Twitter, it's a pinned tweet, so you can find it at the top on the website. That's also my trick so that you can now follow me, because it's now so close to just click follow button, and you can click the follow button. So those are DDD repositories, and I've actually chosen different languages. The one by Paweł Kaczor, the first one, is Scala. Von Vernon is Java. Bottega, Java. Mirek Pawłowski wrote it in Ruby. And DDD in PHP is a whole lot of PHP code in DDD. So that's the start. So that you can read the code base and actually see the flow of a DDD project. And all the miracles, I hope, will be much more clear what is going on. Second and most important thing, if there's one thing you come from this talk, that you learn from this talk, is about events. This is the best starting point, and I think it took us years to understand this. And the idea of events is like the heart of DDD, and also is the heart of event sourcing, and it's also in the middle of, I believe, of a good CQRS system. So when I say DDD, very often I mean DDD plus event sourcing plus CQRS. Event sourcing as the idea of bringing the state from the events, like we do with our Git repositories, for example. And CQRS is the idea of separating your system into writes and reads. And you don't know to need all of that at the beginning. All I'm recommending is to start publishing events. And by publishing events, I mean finding those places in your code where something happened. It's already a fact. So if you have a typical Rails application, at some point, probably in your controller, you will have the post.save call. It means that the post was saved. We can imagine this is an important situation, an important fact in your system. I've called this event post published, and we can publish it. It doesn't change anything, because if you just publish an event, if you just save an event, it doesn't change anything in your system. You just added one insert to the database at some points. So I'm recommending to start with finding all those places which changes something, and to add publishing an event. The main gain you will get from that is you are getting into the DDD world, but some more like thing that you can see is that once you have events for all the changes in your system, you basically have an audit log. And sooner or later in every application that we work on, there is a need for an audit log. So if you have a hard time explaining to someone in your team or your customer that we will be now doing DDD, so give us some time, you can say, I need some time to implement audit log if we need it. So that's a good excuse to start doing events. Once you start finding those places and publishing the events, always name them in the past tense and always prefix them with this thing that is changed. So I've shown some examples like user registered, user activated, user deactivated. And then on the other side is user assigned to project, user made project manager, user finished the project. So once you see those events, you will see some interesting situations. First, you will clearly see what are your aggregates in your system. Aggregates is one of those things that if you start with them too early, you may have a hard time to find what are the right candidates for aggregates. Once you start with events, you will see the possible candidates for aggregates. In our case, it's a user, right? Probably on the right side, we shouldn't have a user assigned to project. Probably we should have a member, team member, project member. Maybe that would be a better name. And in that case, the member would become an aggregate. So suddenly we have some grouping. we see some grouping. First of all, we see aggregates. Second of all, if we group those events like I did, on the left side, we have another context. We have authentication, or maybe it's called security or access. There are different names for that, but you know what it means. It's basically logging in, logging out, registering, and so on. On the right side, you have another context of using the user or the member. It's about the whole thing about project management. In your application, you will see something else, but it will be clearly divided into contexts. And that's like the main tool for DDD. It's one of the main reasons to use DDD is not about introducing some kind of layers, which I made that mistake. I thought that this is all about layers. So create a repository object, create a service object, create an adapter, and so on. The main reason for DDD is to find the boundaries in your system which divide your subsystems. And this is what we very often struggle with Rails applications. I don't want to go into this whole monolithic versus microservices debate, because it's not really that much interesting here. What I want to say is that conceptually, you want to find those subsystems. If you work on an e-commerce system, you probably have an inventory context. So the thing about the information about how many products are still left. And you can divide it and keep it much more separate than we usually have in Rails monolithic applications. So by publishing events, you get this tool first for the audit log, second for finding aggregates, third, if you do it right, you will find some boundaries and bounded context. Publishing events in your application is very, very easy. You can just create a new table called events and just create a new record every time something interesting is happening. We've created a tool which helps you in that, but I'm not really recommending going with that tool. It's very, very primitive, very easy to do it on your own. But if you want to save some time, you can install our gem, generate a migration, which will basically generate the events table. And then you can have 3 places which are required to do something. First is to make access in the application controller, and so all the controllers in your code base, to have the event store object. Then somewhere, doesn't matter where, you can keep it in the same file as the controller. You can declare the event class. In our case, it's class post-published. It needs to inherit from the event from the gem. And then in the controller, when you have some interesting action, you just say event store.publish event, and you initialize the event. And that's all. So starting with the first event should take you no more than 10 minutes. And then adding a new event every time you find it interesting is like 2-3 minutes. So it's not something that you can argue with someone that you just wasted time. It's just a no-brainer to do it. My third technique or third recommendation is that even though it's very exciting to discuss the microservices world, if you have an existing Rails application and it's a big application and you think DDD might be a tool which helps you deal with the complexity, I don't think it's a good idea to go asynchronous, to go microservices very early. It's good at some point. It's good to have this goal in mind because microservices come with very good benefits. Martin Fowler listed those benefits and it's very clear boundaries. So when I told you about the bounded context, so the separation, the subsystems, they're perfect candidates for microservices. What I often saw was that people were applying microservices in a way that needed a lot of communication between them. And now with microservices, we have this network problem. We don't know whether the thing we called is actually alive or not. With a monolithic system as in one server, it's much easier to deal with that. But the benefit is that there's a strong module boundary. You can't easily access a code, some private code from another microservice. So that's a good thing. On the other hand, is it really that important or that useful in a big legacy Rails application? It is, but you can deal with that by just some discipline. Please don't call other subsystems private things, and that's enough. Independent deployment. Once you have a microservice, you can deploy only this one microservice. probably useful, but I don't think it's really that helpful in a big Rails application. I don't think it changes that much, unless your deploy time is very, very long, then it's a useful thing. Third thing, you can experiment with technology. That's the coolest thing that we like as developers. We can write a microservice in Haskell. We can write a microservice in Elixir. JavaScript? No, probably no JavaScript. But again, does it help us? Does it really help you that you will write this one piece of code to this one subsystem in Haskell, apart from your excitement and your career and your CV? I'm not sure. So microservices on the right side, we have the costs, and this is the whole cost of distribution. Good luck with finding out whether a service is up or down. Good luck with handling transactions over a distributed network of machines. In short, there's no such thing as a distributed transaction, but some people try. And there is the whole thing with operational complexity. So suddenly you are not only a programmer, but also some kind of DevOps, sysadmin. You need to handle monitoring, and you need to handle a lot of system operation. And that's difficult, and that's taking time. So my recommendation is that even though microservices in the end are a good goal, I wouldn't go there too early. My fourth recommendation, escape from the framework. This is a pretty controller. It's Redmine. Who of you ever looked at the Redmine repository? Okay, so some of you were in hell. Those of you who haven't looked, I recommend to go there. It's not really as bad as I make it now, but the controllers tend to be huge. Redmine was actually one of the inspirations why I wrote a book about making your controllers better. The idea about escaping the framework is based on many things, and I believe many of you already do something like that. How many of you do some kind of service objects? Yeah, probably majority of you. So that's basically one idea of escaping the framework. Usually you call the service object from the controller, and then you are having this service object not knowing that it was called from an HTTP layer. You are making this code unaware of that. In the context of DDD, it's also important because from the DDD perspective, where DDD as in domain-driven, HTTP is an implementation detail. It's unimportant that we are doing this. We are calling our domain from HTTP, or if it's called from console client, it doesn't really matter. And by the way, many of us, I know, we spent hours discussing Rails and how great it is. And many of us hate Rails. But Rails is actually very good for HTTP layer. So let's live what's good for Rails. I call it the Rails sandwich, that from one side our code base is wrapped with this HTTP responsibility of Rails, like redirection, cookies, session, params, and so on. But on the other side, we have the whole persistence layer, database. Both sides are provided by Rails. So Rails gives us this kind of a sandwich, where our application is just the thing in the middle. So let's make it clear in the code base. With the persistence, it's a bit more complicated. With the service objects, it's easier, but with persistence, it's a bit more complicated. How many of you use any kind of a repository object idea? Okay, so that's a bit less than service objects. And that's because there's more work required. So a good repository object hides the active record from you. But given how Rails relies that everything is an active record object or active model object, it's very difficult to apply those changes and to make a good repository. But still, I think it's much, much easier once you make this isolation. Then you have your tests much faster, and you can be unaware of what's really on your persistence layer. And the fifth and the last recommendation that I'm giving to you is, in fact, DDD is all about the domain. It's not really about code base that much. I've told you that what I noticed in our team, in our project, is that at some point people become more and more business-oriented developers. And that's a very good thing. Once you have some bounded context, some subsystems, I've listed some. Payments, that's like a one subsystem. Identity and access, so the think about authentication. Invoicing, ordering, those are the examples of subsystems. And I suppose some of you have been working on payments in more than one application. I suppose some of you were working on invoices in more than one application. There is this myth that our customers know everything. How many of you have customers who know everything about what they want? Good for you, those 3 people here. So customers, or even the users, they're not really domain experts. Very often they struggle and they have problems the same as we struggle and have problems with understanding. So what I want to encourage you to do is to try to think about yourself as domain experts. Don't go with become a domain expert with everything, but choose some domains, payments, invoicing, identity and access, orders, inventory, and try to understand all the typical things that happen in such subsystems and be very good at it. Try to go to the point where it's that you are suggesting new features to your customer and not the other way around. I don't think it's a good idea that we will have the whole power of what's to be done, obviously. But it's good to have this knowledge and confidence and suggest and recommend to the customer what's best, because you understand this thing that much better. And by the way, usually what the customers don't know, they don't know this left side. So they expect us to know about payments. They expect us to know about authentication. They even sometimes expect us to know enough about invoicing to implement it. What the customers are good at is the one part of the system that we can call a core. This is the unique value proposition from the business. And it's not 80% of the system. It's like, it depends, but maybe 30, maybe 40, maybe 20% of the system. So the core, it's good to learn, but this is probably the customer place. This is the customer area. But still, when I was working on an e-commerce which was selling furniture, it was good for me, even though I didn't become an expert, it was good for me to understand how this furniture is actually collected from one place and bring to another place, how the furniture business is working. I could sit with the customer and have a good conversation about it, and then it resulted in a bit better code. The code still wasn't perfect, but my understanding was better, so the code base was slightly better. To summarize, my homework to you is learn the idea of the DD. You can just clone the repos I've shown you in the tweet. Follow me, by the way. Publish events. I consider my talk a success if at least 10 of you will let me know that within the next week you published at least one more event than you have now. I'll be very happy. So please email me or tweet me. Don't go async. The whole complexity is not worth it at the beginning. Escape from the framework by introducing service objects and repository objects. Those 2 concepts are enough. And try to become a domain expert. It will not solve all of your problems. DDD is not a silver bullet. But I believe it will improve your code base and it will improve your communication with the customer. And with that, I wish you a very nice conference. Thank you for coming and thank you for listening. I'm happy to answer questions. So the question is, when I publish an event, how do I decide what data is part of the published fact? So I think in the beginning what we did was a good idea that we grabbed as much data as possible from this context. So if you are publishing a blog post and you have title and content and maybe the date of creation and maybe the user who is the author, I think it's best at the start to bring as much data as possible. Once you learn about events, once you learn how to later use it, how they will help you make event sourcing, then you can decide, okay, maybe I don't need those kind of data because that's too much, and I already have that data. But at the beginning, I suggest just try to, with the events, just try to save as much data as possible. Okay, is it a good idea to publish several events at one time in one place, more or less? Different events in the same place. In my opinion, it's a good idea. So if you have like, especially with Rails we have, if you have a Rails kind of front end, you have this batch changes. So there is this thing, the most complicated operations are usually the updates, where everything changes, even though there is just one thing that changes, right? Because we use those form batching to change the operation. So I think it's a good idea that if you have this batch updating operation, to split it into smaller events. Like instead, I've shown you post-published, but in fact, what it was post-title was set. That was one event. Post-content was created. That was another event. Published time, where post was published. That was the implicit event there. So I think yes, it's a good idea to have several events at the same time. So the question is if I see any overhead in the code base because of using DDD, right? Okay, so yes, there is an overhead. You can call it an overhead. Sometimes it might be even an overkill. You are introducing some kind of new layers. You are introducing new things into your code base. The thing is that I believe it's only a temporary thing, that you are making things more complicated temporarily. Because in the end, once you learn about those other techniques, what I've shown you is like the entry point to the DDD world. Once you learn how event sourcing helps you, once you learned how CQRS is useful in typical Rails applications, what you will see is actually a very huge reduction of your code base. So, and we've seen that in our applications, that at some point it was clear that some places are becoming slightly more complex, but then after some weeks, months, they were getting shorter and shorter because we started using event sourcing, for example, or we started extracting things into read models, like in CQRS. So, but temporarily, yes, you will have a more complicated code base. So the question is, how do I separate the domain objects from my persistence objects? So the main idea of repositories is actually make this separation. So behind the repository, you can use active record. It's perfectly fine. And if you use SQL or active record, I think it's just a minor detail. So the repository should return a domain object. So that's the idea. It shouldn't be influenced by active record. It's already not an active record. The DDD comes with this concept of aggregates, and it's best to think about repositories that repositories are responsible for two things: for loading the aggregate from the persistence and from saving the aggregate. Once you try to have this very small API for your repository, it's becoming very clear what is actually your aggregate and what was the data that you need to grab. There is not really that much tools to support us in this process. That's a bit of a problem. There were several attempts to implement the data mapper pattern in the Ruby world. As far as I know, they were not successful. We have Oscar talking to us about ROM on Sunday, so I believe Oscar can bring us some knowledge about how it's handled with ROM. And I know that ROM tries to solve some of the problems, so this might be interesting to hear. But overall, the way we are doing this, we are not really supported by any kind of tools. So the question is that active record is good for the read model, and what do I think about returning active record objects from the queries? So once you go into this CQRS thinking that you have writes and reads separated, the idea is that you use different objects for changing your state and different objects for reading. Reading is called queries. And in Rails applications, I would say that most of our Rails applications are very optimized for reading. They are the active record objects that we are returning are basically data structures. We have access to every attribute directly via the public interface. And that's something that is very useful to have on the read side. So it's good to assume that what you currently have in your Rails applications is one huge read model. At some point, you may start splitting it. But overall, I think it's a good idea to return active record objects. And I think active record is well fitted for read models. That's a good question. So the question is, what kind of events should we publish at the beginning only those domain events maybe, or also or the change event, or also the ones that user is accessing something, so there may be the read events. So at the beginning, I say go crazy, publish all kind of events. It doesn't cost you much, so you can just, and you get the audit log for free, so you can see what was happening in your application. And events are not set in stone. Once you add them to the code base, you can remove them. If you think it wasn't worth it to have this event, you can delete the publishing fact. But once we are in the learning phase of DDD, I would say whatever you find interesting, just publish it because it's almost free. So the question is, assuming that you already have the audit log in your application, whether it's worth going DDD. So I think it's still worth it. Audit log is just a side effect of applying DDD, I would say. It's not the goal on its own. And the goal on its own is, the goal of applying DDD is related to how big problems you have currently with your application. If your business logic is implemented with a combination of single table inheritance, callbacks, conditional validations, virtual attributes, I've seen those combinations, and state machines. I've seen those combination of how business logic is implemented. And if you see that it's hard to introduce new features, then I believe that you will gain from applying DDD, even if you have already the audit log. The problem with how we implement the business logic in Rails applications is that we implement it in a very unique Rails way. Even though I'm very happy that we all came here to a Ruby conference, and I'm a proud Ruby developer, I don't think we will all use Ruby for our whole careers. At some point, we will start switching to some other languages. And guess what? Those other languages may not have state machines, callbacks, conditional validations, and single table inheritance as their tools to solve problems. So suddenly you are left with a whole new way of thinking how to solve business problems. While with DDD, I believe that that's the benefit of DDD, is that it's language and framework independent. Once you learn how to solve business problems with DDD, you will know how to do it in Java, C#, Elixir, JavaScript, and every other language. So the question is whether it's worth thinking about defining new languages which define the model, right? Yeah, so there's a whole, so probably some kind of a domain-specific language for defining my models. I don't have much experience with that. So I can't really say. My intuition says that this might be dangerous, but that's all. I think we are still in this learning. So the question is, how do we approach introducing DDD in existing legacy code bases that we take over? So we didn't write the original code, which in our case is a very common scenario. I think we're still in this learning phase. I can't give you definite answers here. It depends. Probably one of the first points is you want to check the test coverage, whether the whole thing actually works and you're not breaking it by changing some layers and so on. So test coverage is a huge topic. By the way, I recommend mutation testing. We have a very good mutant gem in our community. So this may help you detecting that the piece of code that you want to change, what is the current test coverage and how not to break it, at least not make it worse. But overall, the idea is by, I think, the combination, service objects, repositories, and events. Some of those three things are the starting points. Okay, that was the last question. Thank you very much for the whole discussion and for participating.